Welcome everyone. My name's Ronald McTaggart. I'm Deputy Director of the Children and Young People Centre for Justice, and I'm delighted to be chairing today's webinar on the really important and live topic of antisocial behaviour. Today's event is a great opportunity to hear directly from three members of the independent working group that produced an extensive report in February of this year. The webinar will give an overview of what the independent group heard, the research evidence and the recommendations presented to the government. Sally will post the links to the report and the supporting evidence paper in the chat. The webinar will be recorded and shared on the CYCJ website and will finish at 1 p.m. Cameras and mics will be switched off to all attendees, so only the speakers and the organisers of the event will have their cameras on. So we'll hear from all three speakers and then have some time at the end for Q&A. Please type your questions into the chat function at any stage of the webinar, and we'll aim to get through as many as possible at the end. Any questions that we don't get to on the day, we'll endeavour to respond to in writing. So I'll just introduce the speakers. First of all, we'll hear from Lorraine Gillis, one of the co-chairs of the independent working group. Lorraine is an independent consultant with a background in leadership across the public and voluntary sector and developing community and young person initiatives such as Planet Youth Scotland and other initiatives in West Lothian. We'll then hear from Leslie McCara. Leslie was a member of the working group as well and is Professor of Penology in the School of Law and Director of the Institute of Advanced Studies in the Humanities at Edinburgh University. She is, of course, well known as co-director with Susan McVie of the Edinburgh Study of Youth Transitions and Crime. Finally, we'll hear from Fiona Dyer. Fiona is the director of the CYCJ and was co-chair of the independent working group. Fiona has been driving reform in youth justice sector for a number of years now, and in recognition of this was made Professor of Practice earlier this year. So I'll hand over to Lorraine to begin the presentation. Thanks.
Hello, I was going to say good morning, but it's just tipped over into afternoon. Can everyone hear me? Just some indication would be great.
Yep.
Okay, that's fantastic. So where did we start with this? We started this about 2, maybe 3 years ago. At that time, I know some of you, because I was the Chief Officer of the Scottish Community Safety Network, and at that point, the Scottish Community Safety Network were supporting 32 community safety partnerships across Scotland and the Antisocial Behaviour Officers Forum and the Community Wardens Network and a whole bunch of other networks. And we were hearing consistently that our members wanted us to do something, to have a dialogue about antisocial behaviour. I think the general feeling at the time was that our practices, our legislation, our understanding of antisocial behaviour were quite old-fashioned, were quite old, the legislation was quite old, and the membership of the Scottish Community Safety Network were very vocal in that they wanted us to speak to the Scottish Government and to start a dialogue. So that's pretty much the background to where we wanted to start this whole process. From that, the Scottish Community Safety Network were tasked by the Scottish Government to start having a dialogue with a whole bunch of you. The first phase of the consultation process was underway. The Scottish Community Safety Network officers talked to a whole bunch of people across Scotland from all sorts of different backgrounds across the whole policy landscape and asked just a few basic questions. What is antisocial behaviour? Are the mechanisms we use just now the right ones? And are there any different mechanisms that we might want to use? The response was overwhelmingly and saying, yes, indeed, we don't really know what antisocial behaviour is. We don't think that our responses are the right ones. When we know what we know now about prevention, about trauma, about ACEs, we think there's another approach in Scotland that we could take that is particularly Scottish, and we'd like to really think about it. From that report, which you can access and we'll send out to everyone so that everyone has the background, an independent working group was created with myself and Fiona as co-chairs, with Leslie part of that group. And I know that somewhere in the slides there's a slide that tells you who else is in that group, so I won't do that just now. I will let someone else tell you that. So the independent working group was created, I think, about a year and maybe a few months ago. And we started on a fairly lengthy and robust evidence gathering process. And we spoke to everyone who had an interest in antisocial behaviour. I mean, genuinely, we went the length and breadth of the country. We had focus groups. We were out on midnight football pitches. Fiona and I were out meeting people in their communities. I spent some time out with Police Scotland. We really wanted to understand as much as we could about what was antisocial behaviour, what were the things in the legislation and our practice and our approaches that weren't particularly helpful, and what things might we want to do differently. Can I have the next slide? Okay, so the remit of our work as an independent group was this. We were tasked by the minister. It was the minister at the time who was the Community Safety Minister, and then Siobhan Brown, who was the Victims and Community Safety Minister. And it was to consider the effectiveness of current approaches to understanding, preventing and tackling antisocial behaviour. And to think about if a holistic, long-term strategic approach could help to improve the lives of communities in Scotland. We were very clear that we wanted to really think about prevention, and that preventative approach should be appropriate. We also wanted to think about victims, about how victims were supported and whether this could be improved. I think fundamentally the view of the independent working group was that this was about victims front and centre. It was always about really thinking about preventing the number of victims of antisocial behaviour, and it was also about reducing the impact that antisocial behaviour had on victims. So we will go on to talk about how we think that we can take a more preventative approach, and that approach may be fitting with the kind of understanding that we have in Scotland around pro-social activity and compassion and trauma. But fundamentally, this was about victims and reducing the impact of harm. Oh, it's me that's doing this bit about membership, so there you go. So Fiona and myself, Tom Halpin, who is formerly from Police Scotland and is currently on the Scottish Police Authority board, and was there as an independent member of the group. Lorraine Meek, who is the chair of the Antisocial Behaviour Officers Forum and is the Antisocial Behaviour Manager in, I think it's South Lanarkshire, I might be wrong. Leslie, you're going to hear from, and Kirsten Urquhart, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Young Scot, and Kate Wallace, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Victim Support Scotland. So we did a huge amount of engagement. We had 8 working group meetings. We spent a further 5 meetings writing the actual report. It's a lengthy report with an awful lot of information in it, and doing it as a group, we wanted to make sure that it was as comprehensive and as consistent as possible. We took evidence from organisations involving contextual safeguarding. We took evidence from CYCJ, from the Scottish Police Authority, from Police Scotland. We took evidence from Winning Scotland. We spoke to the officers involved in cashback. We spoke to the people involved in behaviour in schools, and we spoke to the Promise Scotland. Just to say that we made an offer to speak to anyone who wanted to speak to us. So these were the organisations that either came forward or the ones that we specifically sought out to speak to because we felt there was some information they could tell us. But it was an open invitation. The working group had 2 visits to local authority ASB teams, and we went out on the road, and we were able to witness some of the behaviours that were problematic. We were able to witness some of the solutions and the responses. Fiona and I spent a wee bit of time on the touchline at midnight football. I went out with Police Scotland colleagues in Wester Hailes and Edinburgh on a Saturday night. We engaged with over 250 stakeholders through a written consultation. And because the information that we were given was so rich, we decided very quickly that we wanted to chunk this into themes. So we had specific sessions, focus sessions, focusing on young people, justice, housing, health, transport, retail, and protected characteristics. We also, because we had the benefit of Victim Support Scotland on the group, We included in our report some case studies, some live real-time case studies, giving information about people who were experiencing antisocial behaviour and the impact on them. And that information very much was useful to enriching the experience of people experiencing antisocial behaviour. We're grateful to the Scottish Community Safety Network, who organised and facilitated a set of further engagement sessions, and we commissioned a data survey and literature review from CYCJ. The outcome of our review, if you've had the opportunity to read the report, you'll be familiar with this. We wanted to deliver 5 overarching recommendations, quite substantial recommendations, that were about sort of situational responses, but also thinking about how we prevent antisocial behaviour. We wanted very much to focus on things that we can do right now to make a difference just now, but we also very much wanted to think about what does upstream prevention look like in an antisocial behaviour context. Within our recommendations, we've also included 45 actions that are perhaps more practical, that could perhaps be picked up across sectors and by people who want to do something fairly quickly. Many of those actions were under the themes. Again, I've already described a lot of the actions and the recommendations are about what can we do situationally to make antisocial behaviour better now, and what can we do to prevent antisocial behaviour. We have included within the report something about contextual safeguarding. We spent a fair bit of time learning about that and trying to understand that. We spent a lot of time thinking about support for victims, and we wanted to include a lot of responses and support for those who were causing antisocial behaviour, to think about how we can work together across partnerships to stop that. This is my last slide, I think, Fiona. I'm going to hand over to you after this. We had some common themes. The overarching theme that you'll see right through the report is that antisocial behaviour is preventable. What has happened very clearly is that a disinvestment in services across the last, 10, 15, 20 years is clearly part of the issue. We've seen continued disinvestment in youth work. We also know and have seen that there is money in the system, especially within the kind of retail conversations we heard about large amounts of money being spent in staff vests and security staff, overturn in technology and CCTV. So lots of money in the system that perhaps could be reshaped to be put into preventing some of the behaviours that we've seen. Very topical today, we heard a lot about free bus passes as the cause of antisocial behaviour. I think it's important to say that we didn't see any evidence to support that. We did see evidence to support that it is not just young people, that antisocial behaviour is something that is experienced and done by people across the age ranges. We heard time and time again about the impact of poverty, a feeling of hopelessness. Time and time again, we heard about mental health problems and addiction being real drivers. If you are distressed and your life is distressing and you are kicking off about it, if you're feeling things are difficult, then perhaps a crime is not being committed and perhaps an enforcement response is not the right one. So, Fiona, I think I'm over to you now. Yep. Oh, no, I'm over to Leslie. Sorry. Leslie.
Thanks very much, Lorraine. Thanks. I'll pick up on some of those themes in my contribution. So in my section, I'm going to set out some of the evidence from analysis of official statistics and from research which flowed into our deliberations. And I've structured it around actually 3 questions. The first one of which there is, what do we know from data about the scale of the problem of antisocial behaviour? What does the research tell us about the causes and context of antisocial behaviour? And finally, what lessons can be drawn from international research on what works in tackling antisocial behaviour? So the scale of the problem. Well, the first thing that needs to be said is that actually there are huge difficulties in measuring antisocial behaviour. First of all, not least because of the ambiguous nature of the concept of antisocial behaviour itself. The statutory definition is actually ambiguous. It's behaviour that causes or is likely to cause alarm and distress. So that's open to wide interpretation, and its meaning, of course, is going to vary according to levels of tolerance, individual experience, and also the perceived vulnerability of those who are actually exposed to it. The definition, it can, as you know, it can encompass low-level forms of behaviour such as littering, and also much more extremely serious measures such as which we regard as criminal, such as things like vandalism or assaultive behaviour. So it actually covers a wide range of behaviours. There's also huge inconsistencies across different data sources about how it's being measured across between police recorded crime, the Scottish Crime and Justice Service survey, the Scottish Household Survey. All of them measure antisocial behaviour and behaviours associated with it in slightly different ways. And some of these data sources, of course, are dependent on people who are actually reporting things. So police recorded crime, of course, obviously under records crime that's happening because the police have to record it themselves. And so it has to be reported and then recorded. And if trust and confidence in the police is low, which happens sometimes in areas which are rife with antisocial behaviour, this can lead to under-reporting. And there's also a dearth of data relating to civil actions as well. And given that's really important, we often know much more about the antisocial behaviour that comes to the attention of the criminal justice system rather than some of the civil actions that are taking place. And also, given that it is concentrated in so many areas, aggregate data at the national level also makes it very difficult to read into how much antisocial behaviour is actually happening. So with that in mind, it's really difficult to measure. So that's a really important finding in itself. So what do we know from the data that does exist about what rates of antisocial behaviour are? So given all those qualifications about the nature of the data, what we do see from some of the data is that actually rates of antisocial behaviour, and this is contra what you hear from the media, but rates of that are actually, with some exceptions, generally stable or falling over time. And you can see from these charts here on the left-hand side of the chart, you can see police recorded crime and antisocial behaviour. There, everything is going down over the past 10 years or so, perhaps with the exception of racially aggravated conduct, which is actually quite stable over time. In terms of Scottish Household Survey, which is the middle section there, most rates are going down other than damage, which has had a recent uptick, and drugs, which has shown such use of seeing people in your area. Is it common or very common to see people either using or selling drugs? And that does show a rising trajectory over time. As Lorraine was saying, antisocial behaviour is very much in the media, particularly associated with young people. And certainly all the high profile cases we hear about bus passes or about the bonfire night, fracas in certain areas. But the statistics on the disposals that are given for antisocial behaviour, which are actually indicative of the more serious forms of antisocial behaviour, they show that it's actually mostly adults that are involved. If you look at the chart on the right-hand side of this showing 3 different types of penalties for antisocial behaviour: formal warning, antisocial behaviour fixed penalty notices, and then convictions for antisocial behaviour type offences. And what you can see is that it's mostly adults. So for formal warnings, it's mostly the over 40s that dominate that group. The highest proportion of fixed penalty notices are for the 21 to 30-year-old age group, and for convictions, it's 31 to 40-year-olds. And that's something really important to bear in mind. Fiona could have the next slide, please. Thank you. So turning to the second of the questions then, what about the causes and context of antisocial behaviour? Well, given the wide variety of behaviours that the term antisocial behaviour has been applied to, it's actually not surprising that there isn't one simple causal pathway. Taken together, I think that the Scottish and international research demonstrates that such pathways are actually quite multi-level and quite complex, and they encompass structural, situational, as well as individual level factors. Now, this slide has got evidence from the Edinburgh Study of Youth Transitions and Crime, and we've been following a cohort of 4,300 people since 1998. And the last period of fieldwork undertaken was when the cohort were aged 35. So we've got both data from teenage years, but also data from adulthood. And this shows that around 1/3 of those in the cohort who were involved in antisocial behaviour as an adult, and we measure this by being rowdy or rude in public, vandalism, damage, or graffiti and spray painting, that's the measure that we're using. 1/3 of those who were involved in adulthood were also involved in more serious forms of behaviour. including violence. So it's saying that there isn't a sort of separate group of people that are necessarily antisocial, and then there's a separate group of criminals. Actually, there is quite a lot of overlap between different forms of offending. And a very high proportion, 66% of those who reported involvement in antisocial behaviour in adulthood had also been involved in antisocial behaviour as teenagers. So there's a kind of consistent pattern over time. And behaviours in the teenage years were predicted by poverty, by early trauma, by experience of crime victimisation themselves, with high conflict levels of conflict with and low levels of monitoring by caregivers. So parenting was really implicated in this. Truancy from school, not being in school, was a predictor of antisocial behaviour. Use of drugs and alcohol, and gang membership, identifying as being a member of a gang, also was associated with that. So in adulthood, involvement in antisocial behaviour in the teenage years is a key predictor of continuation of antisocial behaviour in the adult years. But that means that all of the things that predict it in the teenage years also then are continued into adulthood. So those involved in adulthood also descriptively are living in context of poverty and have had early trauma in their lives. So the common themes that Lorraine was mentioning earlier actually are also shown in the research. Could I move on to the next slide, please? So what does research tell us? So that's the Edinburgh study research. Moving on then to the international research, looking to this wider research and the review that was conducted by Brown and Whitelaw as part of the commission research for our group. A key theme here is the association between antisocial behaviour and neighbourhood deprivation. Research has also found that housing management policies can also be implicated. They can be a contributing factor. Many of those who end up in social housing in certain areas, they come from the poorest sections of the community with disproportionately high levels of family stress and mental health problems. And under these kind of conditions, nuisance neighbours and neighbourhood disputes are more likely. But research also shows, importantly, that residential turnover can be linked to increased risk of offending, both antisocial and more serious forms of offending. And the areas with the greatest residential stability are actually more likely to be able to mobilise together to tackle such offending. So it's not just housing management policies, there's also a thing about residential stability that's really important. So final slide for me now, thank you. What works in tackling antisocial behaviour? So what does research tell us about what works in tackling antisocial behaviour? Well, there's strong evidence from research, from a wide range of international research, that approaches which are purely punitive and deterrent in orientation, which involve absolutely no other support for those causing antisocial behaviour, are actually not effective in reducing such behaviours in the case of both young people and also adults. And in fact, they may even be counterproductive, risking increasing rather than reducing such behaviours. And one of the big lessons from Scotland and Scottish history is the outcomes of the 2004 antisocial behaviour legislation in Scotland, which was implemented, as many of you may remember, in a particularly punitive phase of juvenile justice. And there were huge efforts to try and reduce persistent offending by young people through the use of things like fast tracking, and enforcement was a principal driver, including the antisocial behaviour orders for 12 to 15-year-olds, dispersal orders and parenting orders. And that policy inherently failed in many ways. There were only around 15 antisocial behaviour orders for young children ever made, and no parenting orders were ever made in Scotland. And the wider policy frame led to an increase, not a decrease, in the number of persistent offenders. A report by Audit Scotland found that the number of persistent offenders, instead of being reduced by the target of 10%, as had been wanted by policymakers, it actually increased by 15%. And there were increases in referrals to the reporter, criminal convictions for 16 and 17-year-olds, and the use of custody for older children. So a really important thing is for the government in terms of thinking about how it might change legislation and approaches is that the 2004 Act was a failure, and we need to learn the lessons of that. But thinking more positively about what does work and what has proven results, well, these things work. Early and effective intervention to support children and families. Almost all the research literature, including large-scale systematic reviews that have been conducted, highlights the critical importance of early intervention. And these sorts of approaches can be really challenging to sustain because success for these sorts of approaches can only be measurable over the longer term and not necessarily short-term electoral cycles. There is strong evidence from Scotland that our investment in early and effective intervention and in diversion through that whole system approach that's been framing approaches to children who come into conflict with the law, this has resulted in major reductions in youth offending as measured by all sorts of things such as offence referrals to the reporter, criminal convictions for older children, receptions to custody. That actually is a major success story for Scotland. So that's early and effective intervention we know works. Secondly, what's called situational intervention and outreach. Research highlights the role of increasing opportunities and outreach programmes for children and young people living under stress as very efficacious in reducing antisocial behaviour. And Lorraine was describing earlier how there actually has been a decimation of such services across Scotland and a need for much greater investment here. And we know that these sorts of things work. There are things like programmes to help employability, access to leisure, such as sports facilities and swimming pools, and developing safe spaces for young people to go, and education programmes on the impacts of behaviour. There's a lot of actually really pockets of really excellent practice in Scotland, but many of those pockets of excellent practice are actually quite fragile because of the funding problems and the need to constantly go back to get more funding. The funding is very low level, very scattered, and there isn't a strategic Scottish approach to looking at what services are actually available. So there are problems there. Finally, the last few things that work, environmental intervention. So in addition to these sort of activities and outreach programmes, there's a long history of research on situational crime prevention. And that shows that adjustments to the local environment itself can reduce the risks of antisocial behaviour and crime more generally, and enhance feelings of safety for the community. Where there is a perception that a place is safe, it increases the number of law-abiding community members who use the space, and that actually increases the what's called in criminology capable guardianship, which in turn makes a safe spacer itself. And things like urban design, good street lighting, removal of graffiti can all help. And contextual safeguarding, as Lorraine was saying, is one specific variation of situational crime prevention, which actually shows real promise. And that's setting environmental intervention within a child protection, as well as a public health trauma-informed framework. And that's also important, not just for children, but also for adults that are involved in antisocial behaviour. And then finally, the two things I've got at the bottom here, housing management and collective efficacy. As I've already mentioned, hotspots where antisocial behaviour is rife include some of the most disadvantaged neighbourhoods with a high population turnover and actually low attachment to neighbourhoods. Collective efficacy occurs when there is community mobilisation to tackle disorganisation and neglect and to support community action aimed at inclusion. Programmes which aim to build collective efficacy have been shown by research to reduce crime and antisocial behaviour in the locale and to increase feelings of safety. So there's actually a very huge, long-standing bank of international research which has really strong lessons about what works in reducing antisocial behaviour. And some of these things that this research has flowed into the recommendations of our group. And I'm now going to pass on to Fiona, who's going to tell you what those recommendations actually are.
Thank you. Thanks, Leslie. Okay, and now I'm going to try and move my slide over. So what the group heard was a lot of information, and as Lorraine and Leslie has highlighted, we looked at the research, we looked at the data, we spoke to hundreds of stakeholders during our consultation. We were out and about, and we heard some really great examples of practice that was happening, and we heard of lots of issues as well. So as a group, we were trying to pull that all together and not have a report with 100 recommendations. So we wanted to really bring that down, and we resulted in our 5 recommendations that I'm going to speak about today, and some actions to support those recommendations, as Lorraine highlighted. So what we know is Scotland cannot look at antisocial behaviour in isolation. We've just heard about the research and the evidence there. The antisocial behaviour is a result of deep-rooted societal issues. So we've heard to be successful in reducing antisocial behaviour, we need to look at reducing poverty, increase housing stability, reduce food instability, and address gaps in services such as youth work and mental health resources. So these are the key drivers that we heard and looked at from the research evidence that cause antisocial behaviour. So our measures addressing antisocial behaviour must also align then with broader government policy. It can't just sit in isolation. So we felt the creation of an oversight board would allow us to do that, because it needs to link with eradicating poverty and sustainable public services and have an overarching responsibility for this. So the recommendation was that an oversight board chaired independently should be formed to support a whole system approach to drive change. And this would commission some of the work and organisations to support the change and meet our identified actions on the ground. It would develop a framework for strategic deployment of resources, and it'll provide leadership to the sustainable delivery of upstream prevention and achieve effective partnership working. So that would be the aim of the board, and really being a focused board that has tasks set, so not just a discussion board, a real board that's going to achieve change on the ground. We also spoke about the current legislation. And as Leslie's highlighted there, it maybe didn't have the intention that it created. And we have had pressure because obviously our recommendation in our group is very different from the current work happening in England. And back 20 years ago when the Antisocial Behaviour Act was formed, it very much followed what was happening in England and Wales. But that is not based on the research evidence. And what we heard was the general consensus for those who provided evidence suggests that the current legislation is not effective for the whole system. So we have been told that the legislation works in some settings, but implementation is patchy, and that some elements of the legislation are actually obsolete and have never been used, or they've never been used as their intention. So we really need to look at a review of the current antisocial behaviour definition and the statutory framework that goes around that. So as a result of hearing that, our recommendation again is that the current legislation definition and guidance is reviewed and revised so that it's really fit for purpose. And the review should consider what support and training will also need to be provided and how the new legislation will be implemented. Again, there's no point in just having a set of legislation because that in itself does not make any change on the ground. Practitioners and those who are out working really need to be supported and trained as part of any new legislation that we bring in. Our third recommendation was about data and information. The working group found significant gaps in data and information in that collection, collation, analysis and exchange. And there are currently no integrated systems for ensuring that the right data gets to the right place for the right outcomes. And that is so important when we're planning services and what money needs to be matched to the services that we need. So relevant data needs to be shared proactively between relevant partners and at the earliest opportunity to prevent antisocial behaviour. So this has hampered even our quest in relation to trying to get all the data and information and how we need to know what the issue is before we can prevent it. So there's a requirement for more systematic data. So that led to our recommendation that the systematic review of all the data and information gathering, analysis and exchange to enable more effective flow of data, better information gathering, new systems for reporting antisocial behaviour, and a clearer understanding of what antisocial behaviour really is and what should be reported and where and to whom. And by doing that, as I say, we can be more effective in taking a preventative approach, which is our next recommendation. As we heard, there are many reasons why Scotland should be further ahead with its prevention journey than we currently are. And the group found real inconsistencies in what people understood about prevention. It's also very difficult to build a plane while flying it. So the group therefore recommends the development of a preventative framework, which would be overseen by the Oversight Board, outlining the supports and resources within public services to achieve upstream prevention, encompassing tests of change and scaling up evidence-based existing preventative activities to be rolled out across the country. As I said, we heard some really great examples within specific local areas that we feel could be, if they were shared and we had a mechanism to share that and the other areas were supported to implement them, could be really effective in achieving a preventative approach. And that needs to be done in partnership. It's not up to one organisation or local area to do that. It really takes everybody working together to have a real preventative approach. But also, what we did here, and as Lorraine said, we heard from a lot of victims directly. We heard from a lot of people who had been impacted by antisocial behaviour. So also what we need to do is really address that just now. So as well as taking a preventative approach, we need to do a situational action and address antisocial behaviour as it's happening. So responses to antisocial behaviour must include both prevention for sustainable change and policies to deal with situational factors to tackle immediate harms caused by antisocial behaviour. So again, this requires more effective partnership working, co-commissioning organisations to work together differently, and the recommissioning of sustainable services like community and youth work, including community learning and development, youth work and community resilience efforts. And as we heard, really good examples of contextual safeguarding, of restorative justice, of different techniques that are used in different areas that have been really effective in addressing antisocial behaviour. So our recommendation is that all local authorities need to review and update their current antisocial behaviour strategic arrangements and strategies to ensure that there is a dedicated focus and spend on prevention as well as addressing antisocial behaviour. And local authorities should publish a dedicated antisocial behaviour strategy, which is currently a requirement of our legislation, and rather than include antisocial behaviour strategies within wider community safety, they should have their own strategies to make sure that they are being addressed and prevented in the future. So as I said, within these 5 actions, we had numerous recommendations, highlighted sort of 45, but even within them there is probably more, and we could probably mention about 100 recommendations to do this. But as we said, we split this up into different themes, and there are specific actions under each theme, which you'll see in the report that was shared in the comments in a lot more detail. But there is a requirement for enhanced support and legislative tools to ensure victims are protected without being further disadvantaged. And this was very specific to targeted groups. So groups with protected characteristics, which need targeted responses to address things like hate crime and discrimination against these marginalised groups. We heard from housing providers that we really need enhanced tools for them with tailored support services and investment in community spaces and diversionary projects. We heard about many services stopping during COVID and never starting again. And we really need services for the victims of those causing antisocial behaviour as well as the we need services for the victims of antisocial behaviour as well as those for causing antisocial behaviour when it's more deep-rooted into things like mental health. We heard about transport. We need improved data collection and collaboration to address antisocial behaviour on public transport. There's been many media stories this week about the non-drinking alcohol on transport. It's been reported as not to be effective, and we've also heard about the bus pass. So we really need to improve data and not just anecdotal stories. We really need the overall data and measures that are co-designed with those that are involved to really show what would be more effective. We also want to promote preventative strategies within retail, share best practice, and differentiate between antisocial and criminal behaviour. Some of the stories we heard were real criminal, and it felt like it was children were being criminally exploited. It was more serious and organised crime that we were hearing about. So if a criminal response is required, that should be required and that should be given. We also need investment in mental health and substance misuse services, as we've held, and taken a public health approach, and expansion of services like mediation and restorative justice. And for young people who are more in the media, we really need to address these stereotypes and provide safe spaces for young people and invest in reliable youth and diversionary activities, because we have heard and we know that they are more effective in preventing antisocial behaviour. So lastly, just from me, the key messages from our review was that these interconnected recommendations and actions really aim to take a systemic drivers of antisocial behaviour, tackle the systemic drivers of antisocial behaviour by addressing its immediate impact. So through coordinated funding, evidence-based approach, we believe that Scotland can foster a strong and collective response to antisocial behaviour. We need a more focused approach on prevention, and that means many different things to many different people, but almost all those we consulted with called for upstream approach and one that lifts everybody above the waterline, and that ultimately antisocial behaviour is preventable. So thank you. That is all from us. I'll stop sharing now and we can open the floor to any questions. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much. Thanks to Fiona, Lorraine and Leslie. That was just really interesting to hear from the three experts from the working group on the work and the outcomes there. So yeah, just thanks so much for that. There's only at the moment just a couple of questions that have been typed in. We'll maybe start with Dan Gunn's more kind of technical question just about the age ranges that we're referring to there. So I'm not sure who wants to pick that one up. Maybe Leslie.
Okay.
Or
so I mean, I showed some age ranges on the disposal. So when I'm talking about it, when I'm actually in my section, when I was talking about the research evidence, we're using the term young people really up to the age of 18, and beyond 18 we're calling them adults. In our Edinburgh study, we found that 30%, so when we did our last round of fieldwork at age 35, we found that of those who responded to the survey, 30% had been involved in antisocial behaviour up to from the 18 to 25, and 10% were continuing with antisocial behaviour beyond the age of 25. So that's how we're using it. But the term young people also is a slightly elastic thing. So in Scotland, sometimes it's up to age 21. Some of the statistics are presented as, you know, under 21s. And then, of course, sometimes it's up to age 24, for example, in the Sentencing Council's guidance for sentencing young people, it goes up to the age of 24. So there's a variation there, but when I was talking about it in relation to the statistics, I was using that framing.
Thanks. Yes, it's a confusing world, isn't it, when we're trying to describe what a child and a young person is. These days it can be in different contexts quite tricky. So just coming on from that, the first question came in from Chrissy. So yeah, I think they're just reflecting on given the small percentage of children and young people actually involved in antisocial behaviour, the response and the perceived impact on the community seems to be disproportionately high. So Chrissy was I guess wondering whether that's because of the nature of that antisocial behaviour involving adults, between adults, takes place in maybe in less public, obvious places and settings. As opposed to with young people. So is that in line with the findings from the work of the group?
Yes, definitely. I think for me it is. I think the antisocial behaviour by young people, I think because they are in groups, they are in town centres, they are maybe louder, and it does have that impact. And people perception, I think, as well from the study, that they're intimidated or they're scared by larger groups of young people socialising together. But yeah, definitely, I think that's what we found. Lorraine, I don't know if there's anything else you want to add there, but
yeah, I would just say there's a couple of things happening here. There is undoubtedly, a bias against young people and kind of an interpretation that they're causing all the antisocial behaviour. We didn't find any evidence to support that. The visibility stuff is again, an issue. But I think what's important here is to understand that if whether people are safe or not, if they don't feel safe, it's still as much of an issue. So kind of few things within that, we do need to think about that. So it might not be young people that are causing antisocial behaviour, but if the perception is that it is the case, then that's still something that we need to think about. I think we're going to come back to data throughout most of the things that we're going to talk about today. I mean, I think it's very difficult to make, resounding statements about some of this because the data wasn't telling us that. We just didn't have the data that we needed.
Can I also just add into that from the research that school truancy, not being in school, is related to this, and also the finding that there's nowhere to go, there's nothing to do is also very strongly related to that too. So it speaks to the need for inclusion within education, and it speaks to the need for more services in communities and leisure facilities that young people can actually access. That's what it also speaks to. But I think Lorraine's right, that we've got to be careful not to over exaggerate the scale of the problem, and also the lack of data, that it would enable us to actually evidence that better.
Yeah. Okay. So a question from Ross Scullion: will funding for mental health services be part of the ongoing review work?
Wouldn't that be great? I think what we've done is, as an independent group, just call out some things that a lot of people know already, and that, you know, we have not got enough funding available for the mental health crisis that we're in. We have not got enough funding available for an awful lot of things. So we've called out, you know, those things and said that undoubtedly these things are exacerbating antisocial behaviour. So mental health is one of those things. Addictions very clearly came through all of the chats that we were having. But again, disinvestment in things like community learning and development, disinvestment in community regeneration, disinvestment in youth work services, all of these are having a cumulative effect, and we should not be surprised that that is the case. What did we expect? So to answer Ross, so we have called this out. We have said these things are important. We would suggest that whatever happens next, the overview board that is created, that's something that they think about.
And I suppose, Leah, it's worth saying there, the government haven't responded yet to our report. So the government, COSLA and Police Scotland are currently collating their formal response to the report. So we submitted that in February and published it. So we are just still waiting on a formal response and how it'll be taken forward.
Yeah. Can I just pick up on the mental health point, actually, because that is really deeply important, and it's also a post-COVID thing too that we have to consider, the sort of collective trauma of COVID. So I was reported in our report, I've mentioned in my section of it, I mentioned research that I was involved in, which is a Chief Scientific Officer's rapid response, which was a survey of adolescent mental health during COVID. And what we found was really shocking levels of depression and anxiety amongst young people, 6 times higher than before COVID. National rates were telling us about depression, clinical levels of depression, twice as high levels of clinical levels of anxiety. And 1 in 3 of the young people that we surveyed, and there was over nearly 1,000 of them, they they reached sort of clinical threshold for screening test for post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, these young people are going to be, you know, getting older, becoming adults. In the adult population, we also found in the Edinburgh study, when we asked about mental health problems, that everybody had said there were very high proportions of people that responded to the survey aged 35 were saying that their depression and anxiety had got worse over COVID. And so early trauma is associated with antisocial behaviour, but this is ongoing trauma that we're having now, and there's a real huge mental health crisis in Scotland. And if we do not have sufficient resource and services available, rapidly available, not waiting on 2-year waiting list, it's going to get worse. And that, to me, is one of the most important findings from our research and from the independent working review.
Yeah, thanks. I think, Fiona, you already touched on I suppose the next steps in terms of government and police response. So that Shona was asking about the appetite for change. So that's I guess that's the next steps, and we're waiting to hear the response to the report hopefully quite soon. Then, sorry.
I was going to say about that, Ronald. I mean, it needs to be said that the Scottish Community Safety Network worked very hard to get this review in place. I think, you know, it was something that they were very keen happened. So the Scottish Government, I think, were very aware that, you know, a review of this sort will bring forward some recommendations and actions. So, you know, they did participate and support that. We've been reporting to the Scottish Government and Police Scotland and COSLA all the way through this. So all organisations are aware of the recommendations. We're just waiting for them to give us a statement to tell us what is their next steps.
Yeah. Great. So Simon, Simon was wondering about if you could just say a bit more about antisocial behaviour being preventable. So just welcoming advice, guidance, intervention strategies. Is there any more, that's going to be maybe produced from this at this stage in terms of helping folk to apply preventative strategies, in locally in their own practice?
Yeah, I think I think the hope, Ranald, is once the government responds that they will set up the group and start commissioning some work, because I think there's a lot of good practice, Simon, that can be shared. I mean, I'm happy for you to contact me directly and we can look at that. There's different areas. I think a lot of what we heard was successful was in different areas, working with the local community groups, speaking to young people, speaking to community groups about what they wanted in their local area, and then them being set up. There's examples of local authorities responding to things like what happened at Bonfire Night through Niddrie, and how and the use of different groups and area so organisations coming together to work together and involving the community. They, from what we were hearing and what I'm hearing since then, seem to be the most successful in addressing it, because local communities know what the community needs and trying to have more of a feel of community. And I think, again, we lost a lot of that during COVID, communities coming together and having that feel. So what works in one area may not necessarily work across, but I think it's how do we share that across Scotland, because there's a lot of great practice, but we need to have agencies that we can share that best practice, which is the hope through the setting up of this group and organisations being commissioned to undertake some of this work.
I think to add to that, we heard some stories about children, young people, adults being socialised to behave antisocially. So there is absolutely no doubt, that some families are struggling, and there are behaviours, there are learned behaviours that are happening that turn into antisocial behaviour. And I think that we're very much of the view that this is not going to happen. There are both things that need to happen overnight, but this is the long-term approach that we're talking about. This is not something that's going to be cracked very quickly. This is about understanding that communities have been affected by things that are happening. There are lots of poverty around. Cost of living is a real worry for people, and actually this is a long-term approach. We're talking about compassion, about kindness, about understanding trauma, about understanding ACEs, about all those things that we know are important to have across our society, and that then we get better outcomes.
Yeah. So Heidi said, from a police point of view, just coming back to the bus pass issue, that that there's still a strong perception that it is leading to increased antisocial behaviour, particularly maybe across the Central Belt. But yeah, so you're just looking for just confirmation that so far the research didn't identify that is actually leading to any increase in ASB.
I think the bus pass definitely got blamed and it got brought up a lot. And I think somebody else has put on the chat as well, they're witnessing it's more adults who cause antisocial behaviour on public transport. I think children have always been able to travel. Obviously, this does maybe allow them a bit more freedom to do that. I think with the bus pass, it's really difficult because the Young Scot card, it's a lot more than just a bus pass, and for the majority of children and young people that have that, it can be a lifeline for them. Children and young people are able to travel to get to work and school and college, but it also gives some children who are maybe living in poverty, it gives them that same pass, gives them access to discounted meals, and it can give access to leisure facilities, which again can prevent antisocial behaviour. So it's not just about the bus pass, the free bus pass, but I think we don't have the data and evidence, I think is what we're hearing. A lot of assumptions were made, and children were being that was the sort of perception that was happening, and that's what we were hearing a lot of. But I think we really need to unpick that, and I think work with the travel companies and find out a lot more about it to really make any sort of direct factual assumptions in relation to that.
Can I also just say that you taking away a bus pass isn't actually going to solve the problem, because it just displaces the activity. If that is something that kids are travelling, you've got to prevent the behaviour and deal with the causes of the behaviour, not just take away things, because it won't work.
Yeah. Thanks. So Kirsty has just picked up on the reference to contextual safeguarding. So yeah, she was just asking, do you think that contextual safeguarding approach could be a really significant kind of tool in how we begin to address antisocial behaviour?
Yeah, I definitely think so in relation to, I suppose, children, and looking at the spaces that children are in outside the home, which obviously is part of the contextual safeguarding framework. So I think that would be really important to look at within local areas, definitely.
Okay, and then there's a couple of other inputs around the whole system approach and partnership working and information sharing, I think, between partners, certainly social work, police, and others. So people are maybe identifying this as an opportunity to develop stronger partnerships locally in terms of how information is shared and people will respond to antisocial behaviour in their area.
I think to say something about some of these questions, we're not naive. Do you know, we know the funding restrictions that are happening. You know, we understand that. But I feel that we felt it was time to stand up and say, you know, something has to be done, something has to change. We need to really think about how we resource things differently. Gillian has, you know, made a really good question there about the state of economy and lack of funding. No, you know, that is for others to decide, Gillian. I think what we're saying is something needs to change, that needs to stop. We really, really have to think about how we move some resources to be more preventative. We've got, you know, the legislation, we've got the Christie Commission report, we've got an understanding in Scotland. We need to be pushing that. That needs to be driven.
Okay, we're almost out of time. Just checking the other final points here. Have you considered the effects of Scottish Government policy no longer accommodating young people in SPS facilities, for example? Yes, also there's other significant legislation going through at the moment, which is changing how children are responded to in terms of what systems they're in, you know, greater access to the children's hearing system, keeping young people out of the prison system as well, which are all going to be working their way through. And it's how we integrate, I suppose, many of these responses around antisocial behaviour into those as well, to make sure that everything is connected up well. So I think we're just about out of time. I'm just trying to scan anything there from any other comments that we could respond to. I don't think there's any more questions there. So if we've missed anything, then I apologise, and we can get back to you with a written response in due course. Okay. So I think, unless anyone from the panel, Fiona, Leslie, Lorraine, any kind of final?
I think just my final thought is actually leads back to the point that I think Paul Thompson was making about the need for strategic approach to actually look at the whole thing together. We're very good at doing some fragmented public services and funding them in fragmented ways, but actually having a strategic oversight of things is absolutely deeply important, and how different bits of systems work together. If we get, and the data support it, if we get that far, we'll be making huge strides. Yeah,
great. Okay, thank you. So a huge thanks to our three speakers for today, for all your expertise and insights. Has been really helpful. If not already, please sign up to our e-bulletin, and Sally's going to put a link in the chat for all our upcoming webinars run by the CYCJ. So finally, just thanks for your attendance today, and have a lovely long weekend when it comes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you so much.